In 2009, the city of Chicago leased their 36,000 parking meters to a consortium of companies that included Morgan Stanley.
The mayor pushed the bill through city council with very little time to review, so there was almost no oversight.
They received a $1.2 billion payment up front.
And for that money, they've given up the revenue from parking meters for 75 years. I mean, it's 2 generations of people who have no control over the streets, no control over parking policy in the city. It's crazy.
You have parking meters, number one, to basically regulate traffic flow. You say, okay, in this area you want people typically to park for an hour so that you have a certain amount of turnover so that the businesses in that area are appropriate to that kind of turnover and it works well for that area. And number two, to generate some revenue for the city, to maintain the streets and things like that. When you privatize that, the private companies no longer care about that first function, what's the public good function of the parking meters. They simply care about what's the most profit.
Parking rates skyrocketed, which had a really harmful effect on downtown businesses.
Local businesses downtown started complaining that this was actually really decreasing traffic.
They doubled to about $8 an hour. There's not a limit on them. I mean, there's no telling where they'll go.
And then the contract actually contains contract provisions that guarantee profits for the private consortium. There's these things called non-compete clauses and compensation clauses.
There are provisions that prevent the public from competing with the privatized asset.
Now, if Chicago wants to have a parade, it has to pay that firm for lost revenue. If Chicago wants to close part of a block in order to have a block party, it has to pay that firm for lost revenue. If Chicago wants to create a handicap space to better serve people who are disabled or veterans who've come back from the war, it has to pay the revenue on that parking space for years to come.
The only recourse the city has is writing checks every year to these private investors who send the city a bill for every day that somebody with a handicapped parking sticker parked in a spot, every day that the city had to close a spot for road maintenance. The city is not even allowed to think about building a new parking garage if it needs new parking, because that would violate the no-compete clause. It's a complete disaster, and it will be for 75 years.
Over the course of that 75 years, the private companies will get at least $11.6 billion. That's 10 times as much as the city initially received.
Privatizing parking meters is just as crazy as privatizing roads or privatizing electricity or privatizing water. I mean, we saw privatizing electricity. You saw what Enron did to California, during the Gray Davis administration. Privatizing parking meters is the micro version of that.
In a civil society where you make sure that basic services are delivered, you begin to reduce the costs to all of society early on.
Public space is the stuff that we do for us. It's the we society. It's the things that we do for us. Private space is the stuff that individuals do for themselves or groups of people do for themselves, to make a buck, as it were.
So privatization, when you think about it really broadly, is about private interests and corporations taking over the things that all matter to us: our roads, our water systems, our schools, our bridges, our prisons. And it's about putting their interests before ours. We've got to make sure they make money, so we may or may not get the services we need.
It's the taking of those things that normally a city, state, or local government would do on its own, and taking them over in a for-profit way.
You really do hear people talking about privatizing everything.
A lot of people hear the word privatization in newspaper stories or editorials about outsourcing public services. It's often described as a public-private partnership or some sort of private firms know best.
Most of privatization is about getting a hold of valuable services that the public sector delivers at a very low cost, universally, and trying to move them over into the private sector so that a corporation can make a lot of money giving people what they already get.
Where profit is the first objective, not public services.
To make it easy, we look at it in two different ways. Privatization of government services. A government gives a private company money to perform a public service.
Custodial services, management services, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education.
And then there's privatization of assets, and that is when a private company has a lease on a vital piece of public infrastructure.
Like parks, roads, bridges, water systems.
One group of people behind privatization is public officials. Some of them are simply desperate mayors or governors who see a big hole in their budget.
Private companies and the government consulting industry have come to cities and states and tried to sell this idea that private companies can perform government functions faster, cheaper, and better.
In ways that are bad deals for the taxpayers.
One executive said, "Desperate government is our best customer."
There's more about this than just money. It's about the effects on the people who provide the service. It's about the effects on the quality of the service itself.
The risks of privatization are probably best understood in a historical context, and it's key to think about why many services were made public in the first place. If a fire started at your house, the firefighters would rush there. If you didn't have the plaque on your house, if you hadn't paid, they wouldn't put your fire out. It's not that hard to begin to tote up the damage that's done by not providing a full range of basic services.
Well, privatization is really outsourcing our government to the private sector, and so the greatest risks are a lack of democratic control, because once these practices and activities are outsourced to the private sector, we can't unelect those corporations.
In the fine print of these deals and these contracts, which are incredibly rigid documents, we put in the fine print an inability for us to make decisions. So now in Chicago, the city council and the mayor have to put the interest of Morgan Stanley before the interest of the people.
It's a booming industry on Wall Street to create infrastructure funds and other kind of funds that are meant to bring together a big chunk of money from investors to go after these kind of deals. Talk to the people in Indiana who saw the tolls on their toll road double in the first 5 years of another 75-year contract. This is another example where the state signed a 75-year contract for rights to the money from its toll road. That money was gone within 10 years.
To a great degree, the companies that engage in public-private partnerships or privatization of toll roads, frequently those projects go bankrupt. I mean, very frequently.
So now you have 65 years of officials who don't have that income stream to do other road maintenance, the toll road or the highway system of a state. Those are huge investments over many years.
There are some fairly famous recent stories of these road projects gone awry. One of the biggest is down in Texas.
And we've had a couple highway projects where private companies are allowed to run sort of special toll lanes where people are supposed to have an incentive to get on them because they can go faster and further. And some of those have non-compete clauses that actually have said that the state can't maintain or fix the regular lanes because they want to funnel people into these lanes. I mean, you couldn't believe it. Those lanes haven't been making enough money for the companies because people haven't been wanting to pay the tolls to get on them. They've got the state governments to jack up the speed limits as another enticement. So here we are trading off public safety in order to maximize the profit of the companies that are financing these private lanes.
So in privatization contracts, we see a lot of issues related to costs. Cost overruns, where a contractor says in their proposal that we're going to do this for a certain amount of money, and over time the cost ends up ballooning and it ends up being much more expensive to the government. And then there's other types of costs. There's transaction costs, there's hidden costs, the cost of oversight, the cost of having to train the contractor to be able to adequately do the job. And these are all different types of costs that are often not taken into consideration in cost-benefit analysis.
It's not that companies that provide services necessarily want to, be bad players, but it is the nature of the game. You'd prefer to control the circumstances best you can. Well, the end result there is that when you get a monopoly circumstance, whoever's got it can charge what they want. And if it's in a service that we desperately desire, that we desperately need as a society, suddenly costs go through the roof. And that's not some radical analysis. That's basic economics.
Privatization is monopoly. So you actually don't get the benefit of competition when you privatize things. Privatize roads and bridges and water systems where the contracts are 75 years. There is no competition clearly there when you have a 75-year contract. So it's kind of a fallacy that what's good about competition is used to help provide better services.
Social services are another area where these are natural monopolies. These are things where the purpose of government is fairly clear.
When we talk about social services, we're talking about everything from foster care to benefits eligibility to mental health care.
Turning over the provision of public assistance programs to a private firm is another case like prisons where you simply have a direct conflict between the public policy goal of providing the best service possible to the people who need those services and the private company's goal of maximizing their profits.
One particularly horrendous example was in Indiana. They privatized their benefits eligibility system, helping families navigate the process of applying for food stamps, Medicaid, children's health insurance, vital services that these families rely on.
So in Indiana, the state turned over the provision of the social services to a private company. Almost immediately it was chaos.
There were improper denials. There's a certain number of days that a family should be told whether they qualify for a certain program, and the contractor was missing those deadlines.
We had poor people and people on disabilities who could not get their Medicare payments, who could not get food stamps.
We're talking about real people's lives. We're talking about vulnerable populations.
It took them many months to sort out, and those are months of real desperation for people.
The state of Indiana ended up canceling that contract, but there were a lot of families that suffered as a result. Some cities and states have privatized different aspects of their information technology system. Some of it's smaller tasks related to management of data or other technical aspects of their system, but some states have tried to privatize their entire IT system. In New York, they privatized a project that would be this agency, citywide, all-agency timekeeping system called CityTime.
What ended up happening is the corporations that were responsible for upgrading and managing the system ended up defrauding the New York City government by several $100 million.
There were numerous missed deadlines. Last year, when the contract was finally halted, only 35% of personnel were using this timekeeping system.
The problem was, at its basic level, is that it's fine to contract for a tech company to develop a new software system. That you would do. Anybody would do that. But when you contract and you allow them to operate it, and then you don't watch them, and you don't have adequate oversight, and you're not paying attention, and you're not auditing on a very regular basis, really bad things happen. And there were massive amounts of fraudulent billing happened because the city, the mayor's office and the auditor's office simply weren't overseeing it.
So the company ended up having to reimburse the city for $500 million, and the U.S. attorney actually indicted a handful of people who worked for the contractor. It was a IT project gone bad.
There are horror stories out there of real messes that have been created. And I just think that as a society, if there's one place where we'd want to step back and say, no, this is something that we, the people, ought to maintain a top to bottom control over. We ought to have a real say in how this plays out, not, going for the lowest bidder on some contract. It's in voting, it's in elections. And the failure to set that standard has haunted us.
In Wisconsin, when we looked into this, we discovered they don't have the technical capacity to determine if those machines are properly tabulating the votes. And so without having paper ballots, there's no way to ensure that those machines won't make an error or an intentional error.
Private companies controlling the voting machines and controlling the proprietary mechanisms inside the voting machines is another example of sacrificing transparency and accountability.
The idea of just outsourcing the tabulation of votes to machines that are controlled by the private sector, software written by the private sector, I think is unacceptable. The prospect for manipulation is enormous.
When this is owned by a private corporation, administered by a private corporation, run for a private corporation, and they tell us that we have no access to what's inside that black box because of trade secrets and proprietary information, because of business law, you have a prescription for oligarchy at the very least, fascism at the very worst, fascism being the merging of corporate and state interests, or the takeover of the state by corporate interests.
When you're involved with something like voting or education that happens in every community in the country, the amount of dollars is just huge. There's a huge industry out there that wants to get its hands on the billions of dollars that we spend educating our kids.
There is a movement today in the United States to do something that's never happened in American education before, and that's to privatize public schools. By that I mean it's to turn control of public schools and public money over to private corporations, and it's happening in cities across the nation.
Since Brown v. Board of Education, there's been an increased effort to privatize public schools, and that effort to privatize schools, I think, was born in part out of an ideological resistance to desegregation, and it was married in the 70s and 80s with a desire to profitize.
In the case of today's privatization movement, a lot of public money is going towards charter schools, which receive public money but are not actually public schools. They are private corporations receiving public money and choosing the students they want to educate. The privatized system has an incentive to cut cost, and so they will, first of all, they'll be non-union. 90% of the charter schools are non-union. And secondly, they'll look for low-wage teachers as part of their business plan. So they like to hire very young people who are just out of college, maybe a year or two out of college, and after 2 or 3 years they're gone, because since they have no union, they'll work 50, 60, 70 hours a week and they burn out. And then they can hire some other young person and keep replenishing the stock of teachers and keep the cost low. The whole goal with privatization is keeping the cost low, so they don't care particularly about having experienced teachers, because experienced teachers not only cost more, but they might be around to collect a pension. Given the private model, it's kind of a Walmart model. You want low-cost workers who don't hang around too long.
Con men saying, you know, we want to make a buck off education, but it seems to be working fine, so we're going to break it so that we can then say, see, look it's broken, it doesn't work, give it to us.
The problem is trying to take away money from public schools and give it to private schools, whether religious academies or other private schools.
Many states did away with their laws that said that schools have to be not-for-profit institutions, and so you have for-profit hustlers now coming into the education market, and in some cases running both schools and banks at the same time, so they're doing their own financing.
There's a self-reinforcing mechanism here of state legislators who divert money to for-profit education companies, who then have more money to lobby legislators and to give campaign contributions to legislators. From school vouchers to efforts to get public money for cyber schools, to privatizing the food service in a public school system.
The company is able to make money off the backs of the students and the workers. So for students, the price of your meal is going to increase. The quality of the food may decline. Maintenance of the school significantly declines under privatization. They're not more efficient, and the cost savings are not derived from greater efficiencies, but at the expense of taxpayers. And then most importantly, we have to think of the safety of the students. And there have been examples where a private company is not doing their due diligence in terms of background checks for bus drivers.
When it's the public money, there has to be public accountability. And what the charters have managed to do is to very often write the laws themselves and to say you can't audit us because we're not really public schools, we're private corporations. But I could tell you story after story, crazy stories about for-profit charters where or charters where the founder stole $1 million or stole $2 million, or in the case of a chain out in Oregon, stole $17 million. But I guess my favorite story is about a charter school in Cleveland. A minister who was in charge diverted about $1 million from the charter school to his church funds. And his defense in the court was, his lawyer said, you have to excuse him because greed overtook him. He saw the money on the table and he saw it was there for the taking and he couldn't help himself. And I thought, how can that be a defense? There's a lack of supervision, there's a lack of oversight, there's no financial accountability, and this is deregulation. This is the fruits of deregulation.
Private businesses have to pay their stockholders. They have to skim a certain amount of money off the top to pay dividends to their stockholders, otherwise people won't want to own their stock. They pay their CEOs and their senior executives amounts of money that are way beyond what you would typically see in the public sector, in the government sector. And their interests are not the interests of society as a whole, which government, by definition, that's its interest. Their interests are increasing profits.
The public believes that anything that's private is going to be better than anything that's public. But now that we've had 20 years of experience, we know that that's not true. We know that we look at things like test scores, and if the same kids are enrolled in a school, whether it's public or private or charter or religious, they get about the same results. There is no magic to being private.
There is a whole ideology industry of conservative think tanks that has been built over the last few decades, which is really pushing this same notion that government is always bad, that government is always inefficient, and that the private sector always knows best. And they work through groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council to bring the corporate money and the corporate lobbyists together with the state legislators who can make the laws happen.
I think one of the most insidious groups that's behind the push for privatization is a group called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. ALEC brings corporations together with politicians to basically inculcate them, to train them to do their bidding.
ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council, which was created, several decades ago to be kind of the lobbying arm of corporate America.
They have 2,000 state legislators, and they draft model legislation about how to deregulate everything.
The American Legislative Exchange Council is basically a matchmaker. It brings together corporate lobbyists with conservative legislators.
These resorts where they fly to with their spouse, hang out, are wined and dined and schmoozed and boozed by these privateers.
Legislators come to the conferences and they go home with ready-made bills that were written by or with corporate lobbyists.
And the big surprise, they introduce legislation to privatize our public services.
And so we see really bad bills popping up all over the country with the same language that has been produced by ALEC.
An organization of corporations and legislators to move laws that benefited those corporations.
Privatization of a lot of public functions.
Privatizing public education.
Not just public education, but how to get rid of unions, how to get rid of environmental controls, how to get rid of gun control.
Prisons.
Voter suppression.
And corrections and immigration and roads, bridges, everything you name, social services, everything.
I think ALEC is a corrupt organization, which is why we've supported complaints to the IRS challenging their tax status and alleging with strong evidence that they have failed to report to the IRS the degree to which they're involved in lobbying and the degree to which they spend money on trips for lawmakers. For years, ALEC has told the IRS that it spends zero, not a penny, not a dollar on lobbying. We have a mountain of evidence, literally 40 pounds of evidence that have been provided to the IRS that document ALEC's extensive role in lobbying, asking for bills to be introduced and passed.
There were two industries that were really left for dead at the end of the Obama administration. Two industries that it took a long time to sort of get the administration to really crack down on them, but it looked like they were going by the way of the dinosaur, and that was for-profit colleges and private prisons. Those two industries, because of regulations that the Obama administration put in place.
Because of scandal and bankruptcy and students paying, being saddled with massive amounts of useless debt, the Obama administration began to regulate the entities.
Trump has really rehabilitated those sectors. We had the celebrated case of Corinthian colleges, which ended up shutting down because of various federal and state investigations into their conduct and showing that they misled students into taking these classes and also taking on a lot of debt.
For-profit colleges decided they could take advantage of all of the public money that was being spent, all the public, student loans and the subsidies that were being provided to students to get a college education.
There were some rules that were put in place under Obama. They've been changed by Betsy DeVos, who has members of for-profit colleges within her department. The head who's running sort of the task force looking into fraud was a guy who came from a for-profit college.
It's a volume operation, so they were trying to get as many people in the door as possible with student loans, ideally, and with student subsidies. They were churning people in. They were promising the world that they would get, have high value degrees, that they would absolutely have a job by the time they graduated from college, and it just wasn't true. They were churning because they only made money when there were people walking in the door, so they're doing anything they can to get people in the door.
They're targeting a certain group of people, and it's usually single women, single mothers, and veterans. People whose usually their family history is they're the first person to go to college. It's marketed to them as an ability to lift themselves out of poverty. Having them live up to the rhetoric that they use to market to potential students. For-profit colleges have been caught effectively lying to these students, defrauding them, giving them worthless diplomas, and then saddling them with thousands and thousands of dollars of debt. For-profit colleges are usually more expensive. They say, oh, we'll make sure you're eligible for grants, and we'll make sure that you have all the resources you need, and ultimately you're going to come out ahead. They get students to ring up as much loans as possible, which they're on the hook for after the fact, whether it bore fruit for them or not. Given statistics about how many percentage of people graduate and get into high-paying jobs, what the average salary is after you take a certain course load. And those have been found to be untrue. What these individuals find when they go out into the job market is that they might as well just be holding a blank sheet of paper. The other industry I mentioned that was the one that was kind of left for dead prior to the Trump administration coming in was the private prison industry. We know famously during the campaign that large gifts were made on behalf of the two largest private prison operators. The first is Geo Group, and the second is now called Core Civic. Those companies made large donations to Trump, and they got paid off when he got into office. There was a guidance that was put out by the Justice Department saying that we should not use private prisons anymore in the federal prison system. That was rescinded by Jeff Sessions. Interestingly enough, two of Jeff Sessions' former aides went on to become lobbyists for the private prison industry.
For most of U.S. history, the process of imprisoning people was done by the government because it's the government who takes away a person's liberty, and then a government has responsibilities for how to care for a person whose liberty has been restrained through incarceration. But beginning in the 1980s, there were a couple of firms that wanted a piece of the pie. They wanted to get a stream of tax dollars by privatizing prisons.
That is extremely corrosive to our society, so much so that we now have more prisoners both per capita and in absolute numbers than any other country in the world.
They have to spend less money on something to make money. So the first thing that goes is the wages and benefits of corrections officers. High turnover, less skill.
They have every incentive to cut corners on the training of guards, the pay for guards, the kind of food they serve.
More corrections officers bringing in drugs.
They're run with a limited number of security personnel. They're not trained as well.
More money spent on the company, less money spent on the care. And you see that over and over and over again. Drugs aren't available when they need to be available. There's fewer nurses on call. There's fewer doctors.
We have seen that a lot of prisons that are run by private companies really become hellholes.
These are more prone to riots. There's more prone to violent events.
We've had breakouts.
Inmates really feel unsafe.
There's a prison in Idaho that understaffed. They lied about their staffing levels to the state. The prison became very violent. It became known as the gladiator prison because there was so much violence.
It's been hard to get data about the incidences of violence. Freedom of information requests, they say we're a private company, this would affect our trade secrets or whatever, and you can't come and get our data.
And then the private prison companies come in the back door to the legislatures and lobby for harsher laws. They lobby against decriminalizing marijuana. They lobby for 3 strikes you're out. They lobby for things that create more prisoners.
A majority of the private prison contracts had what we ended up calling lockup quotas or bed guarantees, that in the contract, the government, the state, or the county would have to keep the beds filled at 80%, 90%, or 100% in some of these contracts, or pay anyway.
Which means that the states have to figure out ways to get more people in prison and keep them there longer.
The fact that the American taxpayer should be paying for vacant beds if we don't manage to have enough crime or immigrants to fill them is unconscionable.
Arizona has been at the forefront of pushing prison privatization. And yet, it turned out, when there was a study done, that the private prisons were not saving money. They were actually costing the government more money. But the public officials who were behind that did not respond by trying to fix that. They responded by changing the law so that the state would not collect the information about the cost of private prisons. So they were just going to abandon any effort to hold those private companies accountable.
A man contacted me to represent him. He had been an inmate in a private prison, and every time that he was accused of doing something wrong, like showing up 5 minutes late for his work shift, they would add on time to his sentence. So they would add on another 3 days to his 100-day sentence, for example. And there was nowhere he could appeal that other than to people who were representatives of the private prison. So, of course, the private prison has an incentive to keep people in because they get paid by the day per inmate. Ultimately, he ended up serving, a lot of additional time that he alleges was unfair. And the real problem is due process. There was nowhere that he could make a claim that this was unfair.
There's even an issue of whether this is a violation of the 13th Amendment, that because these people are being held in involuntary servitude, now they're being made to work. We used to call that slavery. And now they got prison labor that they're paying, 10 cents an hour to $2 an hour. And those prison industries compete with for-profit industries in the private sector in ways that those industries in the private sector would correctly call unfair competition.
It's the entire criminal justice system has been largely privatized to the benefit of a handful of corporations. We've talked about CoreCivic and we've talked about Geo Group, and they mainly manage and run the prisons themselves. They are now expanding into post-incarceration services like ankle bracelets, halfway houses.
Geo Group, large corporation, bought a company called BI Incorporated, which is the largest ankle bracelet company in America for when people are released from prison, but they're still under community corrections and are on probation and parole. They're buying up healthcare companies. They're buying up transportation companies to move prisoners from court to jail to prison. They're buying up mental health forensic facilities for people incarcerated who have mental health issues. So they're actually buying up reentry centers.
They're sort of taking you through the criminal justice process. At every step along that way, you are hitting a private company, whether it's the bail industry. The U.S. is one of only 2 companies that has privatized their bail and surety services. The Philippines is the other. Whether it's everything you pay for when you're in the prison, whether it's phone services, those have incredibly high rates. It's mainly one company called Securus. It was just purchased by a private equity company whose owner is also the owner of the Detroit Pistons. Whether you are talking about the commissary services, that has been privatized. The healthcare services inside the prison has been privatized. The kitchen services inside the prison has been privatized. There is almost nothing that hasn't been. And when you think about inmates, they're sort of the ultimate captive audience, right? It's perfect for a company because there's no other choice for those consumers. There's nowhere else for them to go.
Another area where we were surprised to find a lot of privatization going on is in our water. Our water resources in the United States are, a fundamental resource for the American people. And obviously, water is vital to our lives, to our agricultural processes to our well-being. And yet there's an increased trend to take away public utilities, make them into private utilities, or privatize them for the for-profit sector.
There are just a handful of companies that take over water systems, whether the operations and management or the actual physical asset, like the actual water treatment plant. They'll just take that over.
Water and water treatment systems, we see several things commonly occur once these are privatized. The cost of water significantly increases. Rates increase on average 33%. After a private company takes control of a water system, and rates increase 63% on average when a private company takes over a sewer system. The quality of water can decline.
And in some instances we've seen, as with the battles going on in Washington State, that for-profit firm is ultimately an Australian firm. That foreign firm is not interested in whether that water necessarily will be used for us in the long run if there's ever a water crisis or water shortage. They would own that water. They would control that water, not us. They would not be democratically accountable to us. That's a recipe for disaster.
Famously in Pittsburgh, a private company called Veolia took over the water systems, and they've been having problems very similar to what we saw in Flint in terms of lead in the water system. I followed one in North Miami Beach, Florida, where a company bid on taking over the operations and management, and all of the workers would be fired on day one and would have to fight to get back their job. There's also cases in South Florida regarding heightened levels of particulate matter or heightened levels of chemicals. The studies show that it's just not as good a service, particularly in water. When you privatize these things, it's not good for labor, it's not good for the quality of the water. North Miami Beach had won awards on the quality of their water product, and the fear was that if you give it over to a private company and it's all about the bottom line, what incentive do they have to put out a quality product? They have more incentive to cut corners, not replace equipment. This is where their profit margin comes from. Cutting costs on labor, cutting costs on equipment, cutting costs on services, and raising rates, which is the other way in which we all pay for privatization. In Missoula, Montana, they've engaged in unprivatizing, if you will.
And I think the American people need to be more vigilant about the efforts to take away local control of our local water supply and give it over to for-profit firms who maybe they're domestic now, but they might be gobbled up by a multinational whose interests are not our own.
That if you have a global corporation like Veolia that runs water systems around the world, the money that they are taking for profit, return on investment, CEO salaries, is being taken away from the provision of the service. And in the end, we all lose when that happens.
We see that contractors, they don't always play by the rules. And we see that there can be improper billing practices. There's a revolving door. Somebody who's worked for a private company, has insider connections with somebody making the contracting decision, may undermine the competitive bidding process.
If your mayor or your city council or your state legislator is doing a lousy job, you can vote them out of office. If they've turned over the running of your city to a private corporation and you don't like how they're doing it, you can't force the CEO out of his job. You really have no way to hold them accountable.
Contracts or contractual rights, which means if we try to end those contracts, we can be punished as taxpayers and forced to pay them for the duration of the contract. It also takes away sometimes the ability to have any transparency over the operations of these firms. So while in government you know how much people are paid, you know how much executives are paid, often when public services are privatized, you have no idea anymore how much people are being paid, and I'll tell you what, they're being paid a lot.
Oversight's a big issue when it comes to privatization. Too many times a city or state will move forward with a contract without making sure that they have adequate oversight.
When you look at the defense industry, you can see what can go wrong with privatization and why there need to be really strong controls to prevent fraud. In that sector, there's been a tremendous effort to try to contain the cost of uses that are inherent in outsourcing. You hear about these, enormously expensive hammers or nuts and bolts or toilet seats.
The craziest thing in terms of privatization is the privatization of traditional functions within our military. The idea that the cook can't pick up his gun and be a soldier when when needed, but instead has to have another soldier guarding him, and he's making 10 times what the soldier is. That's insane.
One of the things that's happened in the defense industry is a huge increase in the number of contractors that have been used for security purposes, and that's led us to a lot of problems in our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, where private security forces are involved in problems, and we don't have the same ways to hold them accountable as we do people who are in the armed forces.
There's been talk of privatizing the war in Afghanistan using Eric Prince, who was the head of what was once known as Blackwater, the mercenary army. There's been talk of privatizing that entire operation.
The defense industry, I would say that my biggest concern right now is how much outsourcing there's going on in the national security surveillance.
One of the most dangerous areas of privatization is when private corporations start knowing absolutely everything about your life in ways that would be illegal if they were not working for the government. Then you have a problem.
You have a situation with Booz Allen and Hamilton, one of these big lobbying and outsourcing firms in Washington, D.C., where you've got a revolving door. You have, for example, McConnell, who was the director of national intelligence during the Bush administration for part of it, he leaves the Navy, retires, goes to Booz Allen, then lo and behold gets chosen to be the director of national intelligence, then leaves the director of national intelligence and goes where? To Booz Allen. In the midst of all this, and there's enormous outsourcing of surveillance to where? Booz Allen.
These need to be government employees who are accountable to we the people. It's the first 3 words of the Constitution, and there's a reason for that.
When you have black budgets, meaning classified contracts of an unknown amount, billions of dollars are going into that sector, into the intelligence community. An unknown quantity of billions are going out to these private firms. I think at one point, and at least probably to this day, more people in the private sector knew about the spying on Americans than members of Congress elected to represent us. And so it's an enormous problem to have outsourcing going on. It's particularly an enormous problem to have outsourcing of the surveillance of Americans being given over to for-profit firms.
We literally have very, very wealthy individuals and corporations spending wildly to try and make us think that we'll come out better if the private sector controls that which we need.
One of the biggest problems with these privatization proposals is that they are often deals that are cooked up behind the scenes between the investors or the companies who want to come in and cut a deal with the government, and they're talking to the mayor or to the governor or whoever it is, and then they present this as a fait accompli to the legislature and say, we have this great deal, but it's only going to be on the table for 48 hours or for a week or something, and so you've got to do it right now. And that's how things like the Chicago parking meters happen. The city council did not stand up and say, hold on, we need time to look at this. And so that led to disaster. So what these are questions that people need to ask at public meetings, at public forums, or even more importantly, these are the kind of questions that public officials need to ask. City council members, state legislators need to ask when a deal is put on the table in front of them and said, here, we need to approve this.
What is the problem we're trying to solve? Are our public services inadequate? If they're inadequate, why are they inadequate? Have they been underfunded by the public sector? Have they been squeezed unfairly? Have the employees been forced to do 2 jobs or 3 jobs because we're not filling positions? If that is the case, ask yourself why privatization would make it better.
If a private company can make money running our parking lots, why can't we?
If a company says they can do it cheaper, what are they going to spend less money on? And if it can be done cheaper, why don't we do it and keep those resources for the public?
Asking whether the contract has limits on the contractor's ability to raise tolls or fees or rates is very important, as people in Chicago found out when their parking rates doubled, as people in Indiana found out when the toll road doubled, and it's going to keep on going up and up and up.
Is this contract going to last for 50 years? A lot can change in 50 years.
Are there things written into the contract that limit a mayor or a city council's ability to make a decision about climate change, about how many people are on the road?
Everybody should ask their public officials who are considering any kind of privatization deal if they have read the contract? That's a great question to ask in public meetings or to get reporters to ask at a public forum.
Ask who gets rich. Is there somebody who's going to come out ahead as a result of this privatization? And if there is, take a look at who they're contributing campaign money to, who they're hiring as lobbyists.
There ought to be mechanisms in the contract that evaluate after a year or 2 years or a short amount of time whether the contract is working as promised, and if it's not, that the contract can be canceled.
Do you have sufficient staff to really properly oversee these contracts?
Lawmakers should always be asked, do we have a plan B? What happens if the company that you hire just doesn't know how to do the job?
So really the devil's in the details, and looking very closely at the proposed contract and making sure that there aren't perverse incentives that are going to work against the public interest.
Citizens need to be aware of what their legislators are doing. Ultimately, that's the only way to stop bad things from happening, is for people to be vigilant.
Do you really want something that your grandparents and your parents and you created as taxpayers, as citizens, to be bartered off to some private firm, which may or may not be there a year from now or 2 years from now? People should be very, very cautious, very, very skeptical, because when you start to dismantle public services, the recreation of those services is expensive and challenging.